Morning, everybody, and good afternoon, or from wherever you are. So, welcome to the fourth BBW Paradigm Shift Series, and it's with extreme pleasure that I have the company here, or the hosting the company of Aniket Shah. And so, Aniket, why don't we kick just off and just give a brief introduction of what you're currently doing as as a professional agent in the space, and maybe also expand a bit on your additional mandates that you're assuming outside that your immediate professional remit.
Sounds good. With pleasure. And good morning to you, Frank, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone on the line. And before I introduce myself, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be with you. I so admire everything that you do in this space and really just appreciate any chance to work with you. So thank you for that. So my last 16 years of my life has been spent at this intersection of economics and finance on the one hand and sustainable development on the other hand. And I've been crisscrossing that intersection from working in academia to working in the private sector to working at a UN related think tank and now back in the private sector. And I'm currently at Jefferies, which is a global investment bank. And I lead our sustainability and energy transition research team. And we basically advise the world's largest investors and corporates on how they should allocate capital, given the importance of sustainability and the opportunities brought about by the energy transition. So that's my job. I run a 10-person team. We are furiously writing and thinking through what all the changes in the world mean on a day-to-day basis to portfolio allocation and corporate strategy around these topics. And then to answer your second question, over the last year or so, we have evolved our team to also become Jeffrey's public policy research team, beyond just the energy transition. And Frank, that's largely because, as you know very well, 2024 was the year of elections. There were more elections last year than any year in the last several decades. And our view was that many of these sustainability initiatives, many of the energy transition initiatives of major governments, were going to be basically voted on at the ballot box. And so we needed to understand the different political positions, the different policy positions. That work has been very successful. And so we are in this unenviable job, also trying to understand the day-to-day policy changes in the world, which keeps us up at night.
Great. I have to say, I have an inbox, with numerous kind of emails from Jefferies. Your team is incredible in terms of productive output and really very topical information on the events of the day. So
Thank you very
kudos
much.
to you for that. But I also would like to say you have a blackboard behind you.
Yes,
So, right,
indeed.
maybe you could also explain a bit
Yes,
what you do outside
sure.
of your job. So,
100% with great pleasure. Yeah, as I mentioned, I've been sort of crisscrossing the sustainable development world and the private sector world for the last 16 years. But that crisscrossing started actually by working at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, starting in 2009 when I graduated from college. And basically, I fell in love with academic environments and wanted to figure out a way that I could be involved with them as I got older. So I went and got my PhD, and every Friday morning in the spring semester, I teach at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, a master's class on basically how to finance sustainable development. So I'm here in my classroom with great pleasure talking to you, and then very excitedly going to be with my students in around 55 minutes from now.
yeah, the students are very lucky to have you
Thank you.
in front of that blackboard. So, but coming back on and maybe focusing a bit on your journey. So, what would you say? Which kind of people have been really shaping your career or shaping the person that you are today, or what has been an epiphany that brought you into the space of sustainability?
Sure. I've been very lucky, very, very lucky in my life, starting from an early age, starting from, being born in a nice family. My dad's academic, a scientist, worked at Bell Labs his whole career, physicist, uh, much smarter than I'll ever be. But we were sort of growing up in a household where what mattered was knowledge and reading and inquiry. And my mom was home with us to nurture us and to take care of us. And so we had a wonderful upbringing. And again, I give a lot of that credit to just great fortune and my parents. We got to travel around the world, live around the world, and that also informed a lot of who I am today. And then that luck continued, when I was an undergrad, and this is related to this series that you host. I very luckily became the research assistant to Ernesto Zedillo, former president of Mexico, who just happened to be a professor at Yale where I was studying, sitting in a office up on Hill House Avenue. And I just couldn't believe that a former president of a country was there and you could just go and talk to him. And so I wrote to him one day and he wrote back and he said, can I be your research assistant? He said, sure. And so I got to work with him for many years. And he is a remarkable diplomat and a remarkable academic. And so working with him and seeing him operate, and he ran at the time something called the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization. So as an 18-year-old in 2005, sitting next to, a former head of state, thinking about the future of globalization, or in my case, just writing down notes about it as he was talking, was so inspiring. And then Frank, the luck continued because one day President Zedillo introduced me to your former guest at Middlebury, and in this program, Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who in 2007 came to Yale to be a senior fellow at the center and write a book on the future of globalization based on the past of globalization. And boy, working with Mark as a 19-year-old was just truly life-changing, truly, truly life-changing experience. He's a towering figure in all ways, in his career and his intellect and so on. And then that good luck continued because I graduated from college and I got to work with another giant in this field, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and here at Columbia where I'm teaching now, and he at the time ran the Earth Institute, and I was his special assistant at 21, and seeing another great genius of the world trying to put together both economics and sustainability. So my journey, I would say, is largely driven, at least in the early years, by being inspired by people who gave me a lot of confidence to go and pursue my own ideas and go and figure out the world for myself. And then an epiphany that I've had over the years. I mean, so many epiphanies, but maybe I'll say one because it's a good segue, perhaps, to our discuss our presentation. But one epiphany I've had, it's not my own, but it's actually a quote from Bill Gates, which I use all the time, always with citation, of course, but where he says that we overestimate what we can do in 1 year and we underestimate what we can do in 10 years. And I think about that a lot, sort of the importance of a long-term orientation and what can happen over time if you keep compounding your efforts and your interests and your abilities. So that's an epiphany that came to me slightly later in life, but I'm using it as a North Star right now.
Okay. So with that, I think, there's some elements, as you said, it's a tremendous journey. And I think you're edging up to your dad's competency and skills, especially, with where you started at such a young age, but also a life, which was filled with serendipitous moments and
Exactly.
but very impressive. So maybe, as you said, moving into the actual conversation today on our topic, and you are truly an expert in the field of international financial architecture review kind of topics. And so the title of our conversations today is, 10 major steps which could, or 10 small steps which could have a major impact in the field.
Yeah,
And so maybe to kick off the conversation, which are the three ones that are or having such a major impact or could have
sure.
a an initial kind of impact on that front.
Sure. Well, let me just then, instead of boring the
Yeah,
audience with slides, which we can maybe share to folks afterwards, I'll just summarize some of the three main overarching umbrellas, and then we can go into more detail if with whatever's of interest. But the first major set of initiatives, I think, has to be laser focused on bringing down the cost of capital for low income and middle income countries and for projects that we deem are necessary for sustainable development. And so when we think about how do you bring down the cost of capital, that's a very sort of esoteric and perhaps theoretical point, but that is the end goal. Because if you can allow for low cost financing to go to low income countries and to projects that are needed for the low carbon transition, then a lot of the other positive mechanisms of the market start taking hold. And as you said, Frank, I titled this Small Changes, Big Fixes, which is that, I want to sort of say, what can we tactically do in the short term to move in that direction of what we're trying to achieve in the long term? So on this point about bringing down the cost of capital, I highlight a few things that I think are very important. First is that um, both the G20 and the major credit rating agencies have all independently assessed that MDBs, the multilateral development banks, have hundreds of billions of dollars of additional lending capacity that they can tap into right now as we speak. It wouldn't change their credit rating. It wouldn't change their solvency. But and the estimates are between 300 billion and $1 trillion. That's sort of sitting there on the table, ready to be deployed. I want us to take that money and I want us to start using it. By we, I mean the global financial community. And I know that um, the lenders to the MDBs would provide them capital, i.e., would buy the bonds very easily because at the end of the day, these are just AAA rated financial institutions. And I know that, of course, the borrowing countries have lots and lots of projects that they could do with additional subsidized capital. So I'm very focused on that, and I think the we're seeing progress there, but we should bring that over the finish line. A couple other points on this lowering the cost of capital. I am a big, big believer in national development banks. I wrote my PhD on national development banks. I think they are the unspoken hero of the global financial system. Put together, the NDBs are around a quarter of all financial assets. The story of China would not have been written without the China Development Bank in terms of the modern economic growth. And I'm very excited about what I'm seeing with a new architecture being developed through something called the Finance in Common Summit, FICS, which is an initiative initially spearheaded by the government of France, but is now really taking hold and bringing together these 500 national development banks, encouraging sharing of best practices, figuring out ways to increase their capitalization and so on and so forth. So I really like those. And I would like the entire policy community and financial system to spend more time thinking about how do we leverage them for development. Of course, one of the important things about NDBs is that they also provide subsidized forms of capital to projects and companies in domestic economies. That's one of the reasons for existence. And then finally, just on this point of low cost capital or bringing down the cost of capital, is that there needs to be a re-examination of the credit rating agencies.
Mhm.
Frank, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this with all the great work that you guys are doing at Beyond Bretton Woods and all the various initiatives that you've been a part of. Um, it's one of these sort of obscure topics to non-experts, but credit rating agencies and relatedly, the separate topic, but related is the debt sustainability frameworks of organizations like the International Monetary Fund. In a way, they both constrain the ability of low-income countries and middle-income countries from borrowing. And without this sort of sovereign borrowing, a lot of these public investments that are needed that can only happen through the state won't have capital to allocate to them. And when you start digging into how the DSAs work of the IMF and how the credit rating agencies work, you realize there's no even thinking around how the debt that these countries can take on could, in the long term, improve their resilience and improve their growth, which would allow them to take on more debt. Instead, what they say is if you take on too much debt now, you will not be able to grow, and therefore you won't be able to service the debt. So the logic is a little, I would say, backwards for the purposes of sustainability and sustainable development. And so I would love to see an entire focus on creating a new paradigm of sovereign borrowing for low income and middle income countries with the goal of sustainable development in mind. So that's one bucket of work that I'm very interested in. The second bucket of work that I'm very interested in has to do, frankly, with China. And I've been of the view for a long time that for many of us in the West, China is just a black box for us.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, and partly intentional, but partly self-created black box. And I am in no ways ignorant of the issues with China, both economically and otherwise. However, at the same time, it is the second largest economy in the world, the largest economy in the world in PPP terms. It is the largest by far player in the energy transition, invests more in low carbon than the next five countries put together. On the poverty issue, the Chinese model has led to hundreds of millions of people being removed from poverty over the last 40 years. It is the largest trading partner to 120 countries today. It is at the forefront of many of the technologies needed for sustainable development. And Frank, I say all of this saying that most of us don't spend any commensurate amount of time engaging with the country, engaging with the scholars, engaging with the financial providers and
Mm-hmm.
technologies that are coming out of China. And so my second sort of argument is that let's all engage more with China intentionally in our work and in our efforts. And I think that will allow us to figure out ways to move forward on sustainable development that aren't necessarily on our minds right now. And then just a final thing, and this is in some ways quite boring because everyone knows this, but I just think it is an important trend that gets, because it is so boring, it doesn't get a lot of attention, but it has to do with carbon pricing, Frank.
Mm-hmm.
It is one of the wonders of how we solve some of these issues. It's not perfect in and of itself, but Europe would not have made the progress that it has on the energy transition and on decarbonization without carbon pricing. You're seeing more and more countries around the world develop carbon pricing systems. India is setting up an emissions trading scheme next year. China,
Mm-hmm.
of course, has one. Japan is setting one up. Indonesia is setting one up. And I just think we all need to engage with the carbon pricing system more. I would suggest that every country that doesn't have a roadmap to establish a carbon price, we should work with them to create that. And I know organizations like the World Bank are moving in that direction, and we should continue that because setting a price on carbon will help. Again, it's not the panacea, but I'd like to see more progress there. So that's what I would say are three buckets. The decreasing cost of capital, greater focus on China, and perhaps choking off some of the demand for high carbon solutions by increasing carbon prices.
Great. So enormous kind of input. Thank you for that, and a lot to unpack. So if we maybe move to the first element about, lowering the cost of capital, and especially if you look at the vantage point of Wall Street, we still see that a lot of the cost of equity is based on an outdated model, capital asset pricing model, which takes in no way account of some of the major risks, the polycrisis risks that occur. So these different strands, of which climate risk is one of them, biodiversity is another one. But we do also have geopolitical tensions. So, and then we still use, and Wall Street in particular, but they're not the only ones. So I would say that the financial world at large is using this outdated model. And granted, this is for the cost of equity. So this is for, equity related projects. But in terms of if we looked at the fixed income the fixed income market pricing of those elements, you're totally right. I mean, a lot hinges on the rating agencies and the outcomes of what the S&Ps and Moody's of this world, determine in terms of the cost of capital, or through their rating in how they determine the cost of capital for the cost of debt for countries. To what extent, what could be changed? And you mentioned, I know there's a DSA, so the debt sustainability analysis, which is being undertaken by the IMF and the World Bank. And there's an upcoming paper, by the way, by the Bridgetown Initiative, led by Pep Bardouille and the Prime Minister Mia Mottley, on that topic. But what, from your point of view, could be changed or could be altered? And what, role could natural capital, because we don't have a balance sheet or a national account at the moment that's taking stock of the natural capital assets, mangroves, tropical rainforests, even, livestock. And so that's not, taken into account into the natural carbon sink potential of each country. And yeah, that is something I would love to have your views on,
Sure.
on that element, and how we could incorporate that into the overall assessment and the calibration of the debt cost.
Yeah, it's a wonderful set of questions, and in some ways, it gets right at the heart of the question of whether we can solve some of the sustainable development problems within the current system, or whether we need to blow up the system and start again. But if we assume that we want to operate within the current system, by the current system, I mean a largely market-oriented global economy that is, that people have savings, and that savings is used for investment, that wants to have a growth over time and have returns and blah, blah, blah. What I would say is that the single most important lever that we have is by putting a price on all of these externalities that you mentioned, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's carbon, whatever it might be. That, by the way, would be a policy effort more than anything. And once you do that, then the market will just respond to it and allocate money accordingly. So in other words, if we and I don't mean just disclosures, by the way. I mean actually put a real price on CO2, a price on biodiversity loss, charge that to companies and individuals, then the same market dynamic can happen, but you just have to have more expenses in line in your accounting as a business for the degradation to the environment of your activities. And I think that is an important and a powerful point. And it won't happen voluntarily. My years of working on Wall Street, and Frank, I think you would agree with me from your years of working on Wall Street, is that voluntary efforts of capital markets participants in order to solve sustainable development issues, but in so doing get a lower return than their peers, is just not going to work. It's just not going to be a way to scale. But if we started putting effective and useful and forceful prices on all of these environmental issues, yeah, I think the market would adjust to that. So my first answer is that we shouldn't give up on that project, even though it is quite boring and this and that. I think the best thing about voluntary versus non-voluntary is look at the carbon markets right now. The voluntary carbon markets are a fraction, not even a decimal point, of the compliance markets. Everyone talks about, oh, carbon credits, carbon credits. Carbon credits are a sideshow.
Hmm.
It was $2 billion last year that was actually spent on carbon credits globally. Whereas if you look at the emissions trading scheme of Europe, you look at the California market, you look at China, you look at RGGI, you look at all of these compliance markets, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that are now being raised through those kinds of efforts and are pricing economic activity because it's forcing a price on carbon. So I'm not saying that's easy to do for natural capital at all. I mean, at all. But I do think that is the way forward. When it comes to what the IMF can be doing, again, I give a lot of credit to Professor Sachs and his team several years ago because they started this work working with the IMF in around 2016, 17. And it's actually a really interesting set of papers, Frank, which again have been lost in the shuffle. But in 2017, 2018, the IMF admitted that low income countries, it was sort of an amazing admission that they would not be able to achieve the sustainable development goals without external aid and external concessional lending, or borrowing rather. And they did all these needs assessments, stuff that you and I would know, but they actually put it in paper. And they said, yeah, well, for a low income country like Rwanda to achieve the sustainable development goals, it needs to spend 20 to 25% of GDP from the public sector to provide public goods. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but roughly there. But Rwanda is only raising 6 to 10% of GDP in tax collection. It could probably only do a couple more percent if they close some tax loopholes, et cetera, et cetera. Under the current borrowing regime, Rwanda could only really borrow a little bit more because the debt sustainability analysis and all of this would only allow them to borrow this much without, signaling an issue. And then there's this huge gap, and we have to fill this gap. And if we don't figure out how to fill these gaps, then these goals will never be achieved. And to my mind, there's two ways you can solve that gap. One way is through international aid, but we're seeing that entire international aid structure being blown up in front of us right now. And by the way, it was a meager international aid structure to begin with. Very few countries had even achieved their zero point 0.7, as you know so well,
Hmm.
and you guys are working on so diligently. And the other way is to provide these countries with debt financing, basically lending to them. But if you lend to them at market rates, they cannot stomach the debt servicing. So it has to be cheaper than just what the market would provide a capital to them as. And so that either requires the MDBs or it requires the market rate of borrowing, in quotes, the market rate of borrowing for these countries to go down. And that would require a change in how the credit rating agencies operate, and that would require a change in how the IMF thinks about debt structure. So that's what I'm sort of um, um, I'm hoping that there's more efforts there because what I know from the supply of capital perspective is that if, for example, the World Bank issued $500 billion more of bonds, the IBRD and IDA did, pension funds, companies, and so on would buy that with their eyes closed because it's AAA rated paper. Now the question is, once these MDBs have that capital, would countries actually be allowed to take on that much money? And we have to make sure that that part of the system is solved, and that's what requires the IMF and the credit rating agencies to change their tune.
Hmm. Again, thank you for those insights. Again, would love to follow up on some of the those elements. So, if you mention, I think it's really amazing, and it's one of the historical flaws in the markets that we don't have unique, unanimous 24/7, 365 carbon price, right? Informed and shaped by, as you mentioned, not by the voluntary carbon markets, but by the ETS emissions trading systems or the compliance
Mm-hmm.
market.
Yep.
According to the World Bank, there's about 40 data points, and they have a price range, from, anywhere between zero almost to 150, right? And it's almost like an insult to academic and intellectual integrity that we accept this as a market, right? So you can't imagine that you would have 40 different data points for oil or for gold, depending on the complexity of exploration or their geolocation. And yet we do have it for the atmospheric gas, CO2, which is, one of the most nefarious gases that we have to contend with. So, how do you explain that? I mean, why haven't we come up? I know this ICE futures contract, which is, somewhat a weighted average of 4 data points, EU, ETS, UK, and California, and the Northeastern American market. But why haven't we come up with a more intellectually higher standard of pricing? And also, I think, and I would say, the benefits of what I would call markets have always been touted because of the price discovery capacity
Exactly.
of those prices. And why don't we have that for, again, from a risk perspective, that we do have this price, and from a valuation perspective, right now we have VC companies looking at technology, and we're not having a unique price in mind, or we're looking at natural carbon sinks. I'm thinking here in the case of NDCs, the nationally determined contributions as an outcome of the Paris Treaty. We have different prices that are being applied depending on, again, the location. So why, according to you, why is that? And what could be done to maybe alter that kind of misalignment or aberration?
That's a great, it's a phenomenal question. Boy, okay, I'm going to try to answer it. I don't know the answer, but I'll just give you sort of based on my observations and reflections of why that might be the case. I think perhaps most importantly, the reason that we don't have one coherent global carbon pricing mechanism is because many of the world's superpowers, and certainly the one of the world's superpowers doesn't want there to be a one formal global carbon price, and that is the United States. And I think we have to just appreciate that you've had for many, many decades, the United States has been slowing down global efforts on climate change, both domestically and globally, largely explained by the fact that the U.S. is a hydrocarbon superpower, largest oil producer, largest gas producer, largest oil consumer, largest gas consumer, with a very strong nexus between the energy industry and government policy. So the first answer I would give you is that we haven't been able to achieve this because some of the largest players in the world have sort of prevented this from happening. And that's linked, of course, it is, I would put this still in point number one, is that we don't have an international political and policy architecture that would be forceful enough to get this to happen. A lot of this UNFCCC kind of stuff. We're seeing right now how easy it is for the United States to walk away, to ignore, to not implement. And so the weakness of the international policy architecture is linked to this first point around the United States and what we and our historical position on climate change, which actually hasn't been supportive. So that's number one. Number two on carbon pricing is that there are some very difficult technical, but also more importantly, I would say philosophical questions around who should pay the carbon price. I don't think they're not certainly not unsolvable. I mean, if you and I were planners in a room, as as Hayek would some sort of dismiss the economic planners, but if you and I were those planners with people smarter than me, not smarter than you, but smarter than me, we could plan a system that would be fair, I think. That would make sure that it is not regressive, because if you just put a $100 per ton carbon price globally, for example, then a poor person has to pay that for their one flight every 3 years. A poor person in America, middle class person in America, than a rich person would for doing a flight every week, or more importantly, if you put $100 per ton carbon price globally, then someone in India, in a country that has contributed very little, or Nigeria or Ethiopia to climate change, would have to pay when they go and buy their, daily food. Indirectly, they would have to pay for that carbon in the same way that an American or European, who our countries have destroyed the environment for the past 300 years, certainly the last 150 years, um, in the same amount in proportion that we would too. So there's, I think, a technical and relatedly a philosophical question around who pays the carbon price, and to make sure that that is done in a way that takes historical contributions into account, as well as losses and damages that are happening from climate change and so on and so forth. So I think that's number two. Number three reason why we haven't been able to get this is just the hard math, Frank, which is if you this I can't say that I came up with this, but there was a wonderful report written 10, 11 years ago by an organization called, I don't know if it still exists anymore, Frank, you would know better than me, but it's called TEEB, the
Hmm.
Economics and something of biology. It was I think anyway, some sort of research organization focused on natural capital and climate. And 10 years ago, they did a great piece of math where they just looked at the total corporate profits of the private sector, or like the 500 largest companies in the world or something like this. And that was they wrote that number down. And then they looked at total CO2 emissions globally, and they
Hmm.
multiplied that by $100 per ton carbon price, or
Hmm.
150.
Hmm.
And it was effectively the same number, which,
Sure.
if you're like an ecologist, you would say, yeah, of course, Aniket, of course, Frank, that makes total sense, right? That basically what the economy is doing right now is that it is taking one form of capital, natural capital, and that it is burning it and turning it into another type of capital, which is financial capital, or business capital, whatever,
Physical, yeah. Yeah.
physical. Um, and so, the third reason why we haven't done this, Frank, is that the end result of this, if we actually put $100 per ton carbon price on 50, let's be generous and only use CO2 from energy. So on 36 billion tons of CO2, 36 billion times 100 is around $3.6 trillion dollars. That's not huge on a $120 trillion economy, but it is a huge percentage of corporate profits for sure. And so the question would be, what would companies do if they actually had to start paying that carbon price?
Mm.
They would put that onto consumers, and consumers would then consume less, which is, of course, the goal of carbon pricing is less consumption and technological shift. And so I think the third reason we haven't done this is that it makes us confront some really, really uncomfortable truths upon which our system is currently operating. And that's something that no one likes to talk about, but it is part of the problem.
Yeah. Thank you again for these amazing kind of, mastery of the detail. But I think, one could advance as a follow-up the fact that it's too often viewed as a stick rather than a carrot, right?
Mm.
So I think maybe when we talk about the implementation, um, just inviting to imagine what it would mean in terms of the V20 countries, the 60 poorest countries, what is it? They have about $1 trillion in debt burden. And that
Okay.
if you would be able to assign to their efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, mostly by protecting their natural carbon sinks, right? I mean, this is what they have, these countries, and then assign a price of 100 per tonnage, or 150 a
Hmm.
tonnage. So this is an implemental, kind of in individual or in initial kind of scheme to be started up,
Hmm. Yeah.
and look at again the price signal that's being given to it, right? I think you would have to do it rather than using it as a stick to corporate profits, entice people to look at it as an incentive. Again, technology entrepreneurial world, if you give a price signal that's again uniform, unique, and I think it has to be also supported by central banks. Central banks, in the 70s and the 80s, intervened for maintaining FX rates. So why not do it for a carbon price, especially when we're in contention with this most nefarious gas. And then the question is, who's going to pay for it? And the fact is that we should maybe then explore at this moment in time climate QE, right? I mean, I want to pay tribute to the sci-fi novel Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson. But I think it's also about time that we start exploring we've applied QE for COVID. We've applied QE for the great financial crisis. And then why not apply QE now for this major contention to come up with your question, who's going to pay for it? And but that's maybe an idea and a thought. I want to bring in.
By the way, can I just respond?
Yes,
Sorry, I just want to respond to. I think your first point there is very, very, very intelligent and extremely on board, which is that we think a lot about climate change as subtraction, but it is about building something new, a new set of technologies, a new economy, and this and that. And when you put a carbon price on, it will spur innovation, which is part of its goals. New forms of carbon removal, new forms of natural capital technologies that can, which, by the way, those technologies need a funding source. And so this becomes a way to actually pay for it. And so I think you're right. There's a framing around this that we're not just abandoning something, but that we're building something new and a new type of economic system, which has both environmental benefits and probably social benefits too, let's be honest, because the current system is not working for a lot of people at the social level either. So I just wanted to underscore that I think you're right. I think people like me often just get caught up on the cost side because we're, sort of financial people. And so we're just thinking about how do what does this mean for the income statement of company X that I'm analyzing? But your point, because you're thinking bigger than I am about sort of what does this mean about what we can build into? I just wanted to underscore and say that resonates a lot with me. And I think it is not nearly enough part of the messaging around this topic in this space. So thanks for saying that.
Mm-hmm. Now, related to that, we also right now we have levelized cost curves, right? So for solar, and better than anybody else, I mean, this is right now 5 cents per kilowatt hour, and yet we fail to see this, making inroads. What is often said, okay, the implementation of a carbon price is going to be hugely inflationary, right? And yet we have this cheap, abundant source of energy here, 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And it's very hard to see Wall Street, and again, by extension, the finance industry, to properly insert this levelized cost curve into valuations of companies, right? What we've seen, and this is more, again, on related to inadequate monetary policy, and that could bring us to another topic, but we have unduly high interest rates, which have been hijacked by Wall Street to short, so to deliberately sell renewable energy companies in Q3 and Q4, because these renewable energy companies are more hinged towards project management, i.e. longer term, and high interest rates are for them more negative. But yet it's at a moment in time when we do need these renewable energy at the most to cool the earth, to bring down CO2 parts per million. And yet, we abandon them to the wayside. So again, why haven't we seen this impetus of a levelized cost curve, for solar being more pertinently, incorporated in the valuation of firms?
Oh, well, let me say a few things. Number one is that when we talk, they'll just talk about renewable power for a second. I'm going to share with you a slide, which I think is just very important for you to see. So sharing is not turned on. Okay, sorry. So I won't share it.
You should be able to share
now
it.
I can. Okay, so now I can. Let me share it now. Okay. This is one of my favorite slides about America right now, and should give us all a little bit of hope. What it shows is it shows the U.S. power system in 2010 versus 2023. And it shows the amount of capacity, so power capacity that is installed, so that's on the grid system, versus the amount that is in queue, in the interconnection queues. These are projects that have applied to join the grids, but are going through the approval process. And I want you to just see from in 2023, so we have 1.3 terawatts. This is 1.279, so 1,279 gigawatts of power capacity. And you can see the breakdown: solar, wind, gas, nuclear. I want you to see the queues. That's what's next to it on the right.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to take away two things from this. First is how much power capacity is waiting in the queues. 2 times the size of the current US power system is actually in the queue right now. That's important to note. But I think more important to note of that is that 90% of that is renewable: solar, storage, wind. Very little of that is gas, no coal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the reason I bring that up is that the power market and the power set structure that wants to get built, not just in the US, but all around the world, is a low carbon system. Because to your point, it is the cheapest form of power in the world right now, and probably the cheapest form that we will ever see in human history. The good news is that 90% of incremental power today, and for now several years, is coming from renewables. So the incremental power demand is largely being met by renewable energy. And by the way, a big part of that story is solar, which is really the workhorse of a lot of the energy addition. What I would say is the bigger issue compared versus the cost of capital, if I may, Frank, is that I think that we don't have a permitting regime in the world that allows for these projects to quickly get on board. So I actually don't believe that this is a financial problem as much. I mean, there are parts of it that are financial, but the real issue is actually non-financial. Certainly in US and Europe, China doesn't have a permitting problem, which is why China is building massive renewable capacity every day. And so, it's one of the reasons that in 2023, when sort of 8 months into the passing of the IRA, I wrote a big, highly contrarian note, which you may recall getting in your inbox, where I said that the IRA is overhyped. And this is when all of my competitors on Wall Street were talking about the IRA being, multi-trillion dollar, this and that. I said, guys, like, if you don't figure out the grid issue, which is largely an issue of permitting, then it doesn't matter how many tax credits you throw at this. So, and so I think that I take your point 100% that higher cost of capital does hurt renewables because it is a capex heavy a construction project. By the way, probably one of the biggest mistakes in recent human history, Frank, is that when there was $18 trillion of negative yielding sovereign bonds, we didn't just go and construct everything we needed in the world. We could have borrowed a shitload of money, just built everything and gone on with it. But to do that, you actually need the entire system to be set up for that kind of construction project. That's what I'm spending my time trying to figure out right now. But of course, it is not necessarily a financial problem. So that chart that I showed you should, on the one hand, should give enormous hope, but it should also be maybe an enormous despair because solving permitting problems is probably harder than solving cost of capital issues.
But maybe this is also a good message for the Global South in the sense that they might have less that as a constraint in rolling out this kind of renewable energy project. So maybe moving on, I would love you mentioned China. And last time when we met during UNGA in September, you mentioned the absence of China in all the rooms, the meeting rooms you attended.
Yeah.
And maybe could you highlight or give a bit more background about China's capacity in nuclear fission, right? So I think this
Sure.
is the maybe that would be the solution to all our problems. But
Yeah, well, there's just I'm glad you remembered our conversation, and I forgot that until you brought it up right now. So thank you for bringing it up. But yeah, it is amazing. You go around Climate Week, hundreds of meetings in New York, everyone talking about climate this, climate that, impact investing this, missing middle that. And the Chinese view, Chinese corporates, Chinese business, Chinese philosophy and structure is just completely ignored. It's like as if it doesn't exist.
mm,
It's almost Frank, like it's intentional. I mean, it's so bizarre to me, this black hole in the minds of the climate crowd around China is all you can come in. Yeah, is almost it's so glaring that it's almost like it's intentional. But anyways, that aside, um, it's just interesting, right? Like you mentioned nuclear fission, so that's old school nuclear projects, which of course the U.S. and Europe long thought that they were leaders in. Well, China is now the leader in nuclear fission. They're the
mm,
only country in the world that has a fourth generation nuclear reactor up and running. They're the only country in the world, one of two, perhaps. They say there's one in Romania, but they're one of only a handful of countries that has a small modular reactor up and
mhm,
running. Now there's discussion and increasing being written about nuclear fusion that
mhm,
China may be also the world's leader in. And this is, of course, the dream of every climate scientist and physicist, which is basically recreating the sun on Earth and having limitless clean energy. Again, the U.S. Believed that it was in the lead on this in 2022 at the famous moment at the Lawrence Livermore National Labs, when at the NIF experiment, when for the
mhm.
first time ever there was more power coming out of one of these fusion experiments than the power that went in. But recent reporting out of China is that they might have reached a milestone that is multiple generations ahead of that, which would allow them to be much further ahead on the race of nuclear fusion. And I think, again, this is maybe a good segue to me leaving because my students are coming in. But um, actually the topic of my class today is industrial policy, so it's just perfect that we're talking about this because China got to this point because they have a very different orientation of state market relationship, which, by the way, reflected in large part what state market dynamics were like in the West in the 50s and 60s and 70s, which is that government should be a large player. They should do a lot of research and development. They should partner with corporates. They should, be a driver and a steerer of the economy. And then came about the sort of Reagan revolution and neoliberalism and Maggie Thatcher and all of them. And they said, no, 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 no. Markets can take care of everything. You don't need an active state. What's interesting right now is that largely because of China's success, also because of climate change, also because of COVID, also because of all these different things, industrial policy is coming back. It's coming back everywhere, where the state is taking a more direct role in guiding economic outcomes. And that's the big story about China. It was a recognition that the market can't do everything on its own. And I think that's what we sort of have to appreciate a little bit more, and also appreciate how that is becoming a part of how the world is thinking more actively. But that's the big lesson for me. And nuclear fission, fusion, solar, batteries, all the stuff that's happening out of China right now, I think is just a derivative of this basic understanding that you need to have stronger state market ties.
Aniket, I think I know the time is pressing. I'd just like to have one final question. I think
Yes.
thinking here about the next generation, what would be your advice? What would be your call to action to our next generation of people?
Um, and I don't want to give just sort of a high level BS answer, so I'll give something very specific and very focused. Um, the best way for you to contribute to whatever it is that you want to do is you have to be the hardest working person. You have to develop core specific knowledge that allows you to have a seat at the table. Being a generalist when you're young is completely useless, especially in a world of AI, where you can get general knowledge pretty quickly. But getting specific knowledge that comes from practice and focus and relentlessness is highly, highly valuable. And so I get asked by, juniors on my team all the time and students and others sort of, yeah, how do I get a seat at the table? And I said, well, you get a seat at the table when you have something to say. And you only have something to say when you have focused knowledge and you focused on something for a long period of time. Once you develop expertise in something, you develop self-confidence that you can go and do that again and again and again, and then that sort of builds off of itself. So my advice to any sort of person starting or earlier in their career is focus and be the hardest working person. I don't know what the substitute is to hard work. I've never found it myself, Frank. Maybe because I'm not the brightest of the bunch, so I've had to work the extra hours. But I actually don't know how else you can get there unless you just put in the hours and you have that focus. And if you do, then the whole world is your oyster. Then you can achieve anything you want. And so that's what I would say to the younger folks.
Thank you. Well, full gratitude, Aniket, I think, for this wonderful conversation here. So thank you for sharing your insights and your continuous work on Wall Street. I know it's not always easy, especially given current circumstances. But your conversation today was a testament to the enormous position you take on Wall Street, and full credit, for that.
Well, Frank, I've never said this to you before, but I'll say it to you now. You played a big role in that because you'll forget that you wrote maybe the most touching article that was ever written about me and about my work when you wrote an article, I think it was in Forbes or
Forbes
in
magazine,
Forbes,
yeah.
where you asked what would I bring credibility to sustainability while at Jefferies. And that one article that you penned fundamentally changed how the street thought about what we were doing and how Jefferies management thought about what we were doing. And I mean it. That really was one of those inflection points in my career. So I just can't thank you enough for that on a personal level.
Well,
And then, of course, more broadly, you teaching your students at Middlebury after such a wonderful career in the financial industry. I hope, and you running this Bretton Woods initiative, my goodness, I wish there were more people like you. So thank you.
well, thank you. Mutual thanks here.
All right. Very good.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So with that, we end the fourth webinar. And so the next one is coming up with David McNern from the One campaign. So look out for an announcement on that upcoming session. With that, wishing you all a very nice day wherever you are, and looking forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.